Somewhere in the world at this moment, there are more than 1 billion people wearing the same garment. Not the same style of garment, not the same idea of one, but a specific object with a specific ancestry. Two legs of heavy cotton twill, woven with a colored warp and a white weft so that it fades from the outside in, cut with 5 pockets, one of them small and useless, and inside another, and reinforced at the corners with small metal studs that were designed to solve a problem almost nobody now has. It is worn to funerals and to fields and to board meetings. It has been buried in permafrost and hung in the Smithsonian and traded on the black markets of a dozen countries, where owning a pair was for a while a political act. There is no other object made by human beings that has been simultaneously the uniform of manual laborers, of film stars, of teenage rebellion, and of middle-aged respectability. Archaeologists 1,000 years from now will find it in every layer. And on the back of most of them, at the base of the spine, there is a small patch bearing the name of a man who almost certainly never wore a pair in his life. He was a wholesaler. He dealt in bolts of cloth, in boxes of buttons, in cases of blankets, and he wore a dark suit and a high collar to his office 6 days a week for nearly 50 years. And he did not sew, did not design, did not invent, and did not, as far as anyone has ever been able to establish, spend a single hour of his life panning for gold. The garment that carries his name was invented by somebody else in another state, out of a fabric that was not blue, to solve a complaint made by a woman whose name has not survived. His name was Levi Strauss, and he was born Loeb, in a village in Bavaria where his family was not permitted to own land. This channel makes documentaries on the great dynasties of old money, how they were built, how they were spent, and what remained when the last of the family had gone. Subscribe for a new episode every week. What follows is not the story that appears on the leather patch, and it is not the story the company itself told for the better part of a century, because for a good deal of that century, the company had no idea what its own story was. Everything it had, the correspondence, the ledgers, the earliest garments, the photographs, the invoices going back to the 1850s, burned in a single week in 1906, and for 80 years afterwards, the firm's history was reconstructed largely from advertising copy, magazine articles, and one television drama. It was not until 1989, when a professional archivist was hired and an archive established, that anybody began the patient work of separating what had happened from what had been repeated. What she found was, as such things usually are, less romantic and considerably more interesting. It begins in a place that no longer has a Jewish community, in a country that no longer exists under that name, in the years when a great many people concluded that the future was somewhere else. Buttenheim sits in Upper Franconia, in the hilly country between Bamberg and Nuremberg, and in the 1820s it held perhaps 800 people. Roughly 1 in 5 of them was Jewish. This was not unusual for the region. The Franconian provinces had been folded into the Kingdom of Bavaria a generation earlier, and they contained a dense network of Jewish villages, some of them centuries old, most of them small, all of them living under a body of law designed to keep them that way. The specifics of that law are worth stating plainly because they explain everything that follows. Jews could live only in designated parts of a town. They could not, except in rare cases, acquire land. They could not belong to the craft guilds, which meant that the ordinary skilled trades were closed to them, which in turn meant that a very large proportion of Bavarian Jews made their living in the one occupation the guilds did not control, buying goods in one place and selling them in another. Peddling dry goods, cloth, thread, buttons, ribbon, pots, carried on the back or in a cart from village to village. And there was a further law, the one that mattered most to a young family. The number of Jewish marriages permitted in each community was capped. A man could not simply marry, a place had to fall vacant. Sons who could not inherit a registered position could not, in practice, start a household at all. Into this arrangement, on the 26th of February, 1829, in a house on the main road that is now a museum, a boy was born and named Loeb. His father was Hirsch Strauss, a peddler of dry goods. His mother was Rebecca, Hirsch's second wife, The first had died some years earlier. Between them, the two marriages had produced 7 children, and Loeb was the last of them. The older ones did not wait. One of the brothers went to London in the early 1830s and later crossed to New York. A sister followed in the late 30s. 2 more brothers, Jonathan and Lippman, went out in the early 40s and settled in the district of Lower Manhattan that everybody then called Little Germany. And there they began doing in America precisely what the family had been permitted to do in Bavaria, selling dry goods. The firm was called J. Strauss Brother and Company. In New York, Jonathan became Jonas and Lippman became Lewis, which was the first of several name changes in this story and will not be the last. Hirsch stayed. He was ill. The disease was tuberculosis, and it was a slow one, and there was no question of a crossing. He died in June of 1846. Loeb was 17. What happened to the household afterwards was, by the standards of the time and place, ordinary and brutal. A widow with 2 small children of her own and a stepdaughter still at home, in a village where the harvests of the 1840s had been failing across the whole region and the old rural crafts were being undone by the first machines, had a very short list of options. Rebecca took the one that thousands of families in Franconia were taking in the same decade. She applied for exit papers. The application was published in the official Bavarian Gazette so that any creditor who was owed money might collect before the family left the kingdom. There is something in that detail worth holding on to. A woman leaving a country that had never allowed her family to own the ground under their house was required, on the way out, to advertise herself in the government newspaper in case anybody wanted to stop her. At the end of the 1840s, Rebecca Strauss and 3 of her children sailed for New York. The sources disagree by a year over exactly when. What is not in dispute is who was waiting for them on the other side, Jonas and Lewis, and a dry goods business already running. The Lower East Side of Manhattan in those years was a dense, loud, largely German-speaking city inside a city, and the trade the family worked in was the entry-level occupation of nearly every immigrant who arrived without capital. A young man was given a pack, a route, and a line of credit from the family firm, and he walked. He walked into Kentucky and into the river towns and into the small settlements where there were no shops, and he sold thread and needles and cloth and cheap jewelry, and if he was any good, he graduated in a few years from the pack to a cart, from the cart to a fixed store, and from the store to wholesaling to other men with packs. That was the ladder. Half the great merchant fortunes of 19th century America started on the bottom rung of it, and a striking number of them started in the same few streets of Little Germany. The census taker who came through in the summer of 1850 recorded the household on Division Street. Jonas, with his wife and children, Lewis, the mother Rebecca, and a young man whose occupation was given as peddler, dry goods, and whose name he wrote down as Levi. The boy had begun answering to Levi. Making the name pronounceable to Americans was part of the work. And then, from the far side of the continent, came the news that reorganized the entire economy of the United States for a decade. Gold had been found at a sawmill on the American River in the January of 1848, in a territory the United States had just taken from Mexico and had not yet organized. By the following spring, the news had reached the East Coast and Europe, and by the end of 1849, something in the order of 100,000 people had gone west by ship around the Horn, by ship to Panama, and across the isthmus on mules, or overland across 2,000 miles of plain and mountain. San Francisco, which had been a settlement of a few hundred people with a Spanish name, became a city of some 25,000 in a little over a year. Ships arrived and were abandoned in the bay by crews who walked off to the diggings, and some of those hulls were run aground and turned into warehouses and hotels and are still under the financial district today. The town burned to the ground repeatedly in those first years and was rebuilt each time in a matter of weeks. Everything had to be imported. Everything was scarce. And in an economy where the only product was gold dust, the price of ordinary objects went to places that read now like misprints. This is the moment at which almost every version of the story has a young man arriving with a roll of canvas. What actually happened, it is more mundane and rather more shrewd. The Strauss brothers in New York decided to open a West Coast branch of the family firm, and Levi was sent to run it. He was 23. Before he went, he completed the business he had begun some years earlier. At the end of January 1853, he became a citizen of the United States. In February, he sailed. He went by the Panama route, which meant a ship to the Caribbean coast, a crossing of the isthmus through the fever country, and a second ship up the Pacific side. He landed in San Francisco in the March of 1853. He did not go to the diggings. He never went to the diggings. He had grown up in a family whose entire accumulated knowledge concerned what happens to the price of cloth when it has to travel, and he had arrived in a place where everything had to travel and nothing was made. He opened a wholesale dry goods business under his own name, importing from his brothers in New York and selling on to the small stores that were opening in every mining camp and river town in California, and before long in Nevada, Oregon, Idaho, Utah, and Arizona. The men in the water panning gravel were the customers of his customers. He was 2 steps back from the romance and 2 steps closer to the money, which is where the fortunes in a gold rush are always made, and which is a lesson that has been available to everybody for 175 years and is still routinely ignored. His sister Fanny, born Vogela and the only other child of his mother, came out to join him with her husband, David Stern, a Bavarian who had made his own way from New York through the American South before turning west. Stern went into the business as a partner. Over the following years, the firm moved premises several times, each time to a larger building, and by the middle 60s, it was established on Battery Street in what had become the commercial heart of the city. What Levi Strauss actually did for the next 20 years is the least dramatic and most important part of his life, and it is almost never described because there is no scene in it. He bought, he shipped. He extended credit to storekeepers in mining camps that might not exist in 2 years and judged which ones would and was right often enough to keep going. He traveled the interior himself, at least in the early years, over roads that were not roads. He learned which fabrics survived the trade and which ones came back. He built the thing that every great merchant house is actually made of, which is not a product but a list, the names of several hundred shopkeepers scattered over a quarter of a continent who would take his goods and pay for them. By the 1860s, he was one of the established merchants of San Francisco. He sat on the boards of local companies. He put money into real estate downtown and later into railways. In the mid-70s, he bought a woolen mill so that he could weave some of his own cloth rather than buy it, which is the classic move of a wholesaler who has decided that the margin upstream belongs to him. He also became, quietly and without any apparent interest in being noticed for it, one of the more consistent givers in the city. The first recorded donation was $5 to the Orphan Asylum Society, made in 1854, a year after he arrived, when he had almost nothing. The pattern held for the next half-century, and the direction of it never changed. Children and the education of the young, the Pacific Hebrew Orphan Asylum, the Roman Catholic Orphanage and the Protestant one, the Eureka Benevolent Society, the Hebrew Board of Relief, a free kindergarten for the children of the poor, at whose fundraising entertainment he appeared in the last year of his life. He was a founding member of the local Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. He was also a founder of Temple Emmanuel, and this connects him to something larger than himself. San Francisco in the 1850s was a rare thing in the 19th century world. A substantial city built from nothing, so fast by people who had all arrived at once, that no established order existed to exclude anybody. The Bavarian and Alsatian Jewish merchants who came in with the rush, the Seligmans, the Lezards, the Gumps, the Sloss and Lilienthal families, the Haas brothers, the Stearns, did not arrive into a society and ask to be admitted. They arrived at the same time as everyone else and helped build it. They ran the banks, the wholesale houses, the wool trade, and eventually the philanthropy, and they were on the boards of institutions their cousins in Bavaria could not have entered as customers. There was prejudice in California, and a great deal of it, but it was aimed mainly elsewhere and with terrible force at the Chinese laborers who had built the railroads. The German Jewish merchant class of San Francisco occupied, for 2 or 3 generations, a position that had no real equivalent on the East Coast, where old money was already in place and had decided who was acceptable. In Newport and on Fifth Avenue in these same decades, A set of families was busily inventing rules for keeping people out. In San Francisco, there had not been time. It is worth describing the world those goods were going to, because it explains the object at the center of this story better than any amount of talk about denim. The customers of Levi Strauss and Company were not miners. They were the men who kept the stores in the places where the miners lived, and those places were among the strangest settlements ever thrown up on the American continent. A vein was found. Within a season, there was a town of several thousand men, with a main street, 4 saloons for every church, a newspaper, a bank, a photographer, and a general store, all of it built of unseasoned timber hauled from somewhere else. Within a decade, if the vein failed, there was nothing there at all except the timber falling down. The biggest of them was on the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, where in the late 1850s, a body of silver ore was found that turned out to be one of the richest ever discovered. Virginia City rose on top of it, and the fortunes that came out of that hillside built a good deal of San Francisco, including several of the mansions on the hill above the harbor and a considerable part of the city's banking. Jacob Davis was there for a while, selling pork wholesale, and did not get rich. What all of these places had in common was the nature of the work. This was not agriculture, and it was not manufacture. It was rock, breaking it, moving it, timbering the holes it left, and hauling it out on wagons over ground that destroyed axles. Men in that trade knelt constantly, carried loads on their hips, and crawled into spaces. And the ordinary trousers available to them were made to a pattern devised for people who did none of those things. There was also freight. The transcontinental line was joined in 1869, which ought to have solved the problem of getting goods across the country, and to some extent did. But the railroad companies had then discovered what a monopoly on a continent is worth and priced accordingly. And for years afterwards, it remained cheaper, in many cases, to ship goods from New York around the whole of South America by sea than to send them overland by train. A wholesaler in San Francisco therefore lived and died by his ability to judge, months in advance, what several hundred storekeepers scattered across a quarter of a continent would want, and to have it already on the water. That was the trade. It rewarded caution, memory, and an accurate sense of other people's creditworthiness, and it punished imagination. It is not a coincidence that the man who spent 20 years doing it did not invent anything, and that when somebody else did, he recognized it immediately, none of which had anything to do with trousers. By 1870, Levi Strauss was 41 years old, unmarried, prosperous, respected, and entirely unknown outside the wholesale trade of the Pacific Coast. If he had died that year, there would be no reason for anyone to have heard of him. What changed his life was a letter from a man he had never thought about very much, who was at that point one customer among hundreds. Jacob Eufes was born in Riga on the Baltic in 1831. Riga was then a Russian port and is now the capital of Latvia, and its Jewish community lived under a set of restrictions that were, if anything, heavier than Bavaria's. He trained as a tailor. At 23, he emigrated to the United States, and somewhere in the process, his name became Jacob Davis, which was the same accommodation Lube had made a few years earlier in a different direction. What happened to him over the next 15 years reads like a catalog of every way there was to not make money in 19th century America. He worked as a journeyman tailor in New York, then in Maine. He went to the Pacific Coast. He crossed into Canada and panned for gold on the Fraser River and came away with nothing. He sold tobacco. He sold pork wholesale in Virginia City on the Comstock where the silver was. In 1865, in Canada, he married a woman named Anna, and over the following 8 years they had 6 children. In 1868, he settled in Reno, in Nevada, and went into partnership with a brewer named Frederick Hertling, helping to build the brewery. The brewery failed within about a year and left them both with nothing. So he went back to the only thing he actually knew, which was cutting and sewing, and he made the observation that changed his circumstances. Reno existed because the Central Pacific Railroad ran through it. The country around it was full of surveyors, teamsters, freighters, and railroad crews. And what those men needed was not fashion. They needed tents, wagon covers, horse blankets, and clothing that would survive being worn every day in a landscape made largely of rock and grit. He bought heavy cloth for it, including duck, a stiff, tight, undyed cotton canvas used for tents and awnings, from a wholesaler in San Francisco who had the widest stock on the coast. That wholesaler was Levi Strauss and Company. And in January of 1871, a woman came into the shop. We know this because Davis described it under oath 4 years later in a deposition taken during a patent lawsuit, which is the reason it is one of the few genuinely documented scenes in the entire history of this garment. Her husband, she said, was a large man and hard on his clothes, and the trousers she bought kept splitting. She wanted a pair made that would not. She was prepared to pay for them. Davis had lying on the bench the small copper rivets he used for fastening the corners of horse blankets. He looked at the pair of trousers, and he understood the failure the way a tailor understands it. Cloth does not tear in the middle of a panel. It tears where the seams converge and the load concentrates, at the two top corners of each side pocket and at the base of the fly. Everywhere else, the fabric is stronger than the man, so he put a rivet through each of those points so that the stress was carried by metal rather than by thread. It is not a complicated idea. It is not even strictly a new one. Rivets had been used on harness and on boots and on saddlery for as long as there had been metalworking. What was new was applying them to the specific stress geometry of a working man's trousers. And the result was a garment that did not fail where every other pair failed. He charged her for the work, and she paid it. The husband did not come back with a complaint. Other men saw the trousers. Within 18 months, Jacob Davis had made and sold something over 200 pairs, in blue denim and in white duck, and he could not sew them fast enough. And he had begun to understand two things at the same time. The first was that he had, for the first time in a wandering and unsuccessful life, hold of something genuinely valuable. The second was that a tailor in Reno with no capital was in no position to keep it. Any competitor with a bench and a bag of rivets could copy the idea in an afternoon, and several already had. The protection available to him was a United States patent. The fee to file was $68. He did not have $68. In the summer of 1872, he wrote to his supplier in San Francisco. The original letter has not survived. Very little from those years has, for reasons that will become clear, but a transcription made from it does, and its contents are not in dispute. He settled an outstanding account. He enclosed 2 sample pairs, one blue and one white. He described what he had done and why it worked. He said he had made about 200 of them and could not keep up with the orders. And he proposed that Levi Strauss pay the filing fee and take out the patent, and that the two of them share what came of it. What Levi Strauss did next is the single most consequential decision of his commercial life, and it is worth being precise about the alternatives. He could have ignored the letter. He was a substantial wholesaler in a substantial city, and this was a tailor in Reno with an idea about metal studs. He could, with rather less scruple and no legal difficulty whatever, have filed the patent in his own name alone. Davis had put the whole thing in writing and posted it to him, and had no lawyer, no money, and no leverage. This was the 1870s. Men did that sort of thing constantly and were admired for it. Instead, he paid the fee, engaged the attorneys, and filed jointly. The application was submitted in the summer of 1872 and initially met resistance from the Patent Office, which took the reasonable view that fastening cloth with rivets was not obviously novel. It was resubmitted, narrowed, argued, and on the 20th of May, 1873, patent number 139,121 was granted in the joint names of Jacob W. Davis and Levi Strauss and Company for an improvement in fastening pocket openings. The blue jean has a birth certificate, and that is it. It is not an invention of the gold rush. The rush was over by then and had been for 20 years. It is an invention of the railroad age, made in Nevada, patented in Washington, and financed from San Francisco. The patent ran for 17 years, and what it gave the two men was not the exclusive right to make work trousers. It gave them the exclusive right, in the United States, to put rivets in them. Anybody could make heavy cotton trousers, and everybody did. Nobody else could reinforce them at the points where they broke. Strauss brought Davis and his family to San Francisco to run the manufacturing. This is the second decision worth noticing. The man who had the idea was not paid off and dismissed. He was installed. Davis sold his property in Reno, moved west, and spent the rest of his working life in charge of production, eventually of a factory employing several hundred people, mostly women at sewing machines. He stayed with the firm for 35 years, until his death in 1900 and odd, and his son took over the same work afterwards. The making of them is a part of the story that gets left out, and it should not be, because it is where most of the actual human hours went. At first, there was no factory. The pattern followed by every garment business of the period was outwork. Cloth was cut centrally and sent out in bundles to women who sewed at home on their own machines paid by the piece. The sewing machine had come into general use only a couple of decades earlier, and it had produced almost immediately an entire economy of women working alone in tenement rooms for rates set by somebody they never met. It was the cheapest possible arrangement, and it was universal. By the 1880s, Levi, Strauss and Company had built its own factory instead, and put Jacob Davis in charge of it. And the workforce was, as garment workforces have always been, overwhelmingly female. Hundreds of women, at machines, in rows, in a building on the San Francisco waterfront, making a garment worn exclusively by men in country most of them would never see. The firm's reputation among them appears, from the fragments that survive, to have been good by the standards of the trade, which admittedly is not a high bar. Wages were paid on time. There is a description of the founder that came from a woman who had worked one of those machines, recorded long afterwards, in which she said he was a hard man, but a decent one. And that combination from an employee about a 19th century employer is worth more than any amount of testimonial from a board of trade. What is certain is that the firm never had a serious labor dispute in his lifetime. In a city and a decade in which labor disputes were the normal condition of business, and that when the factory was destroyed, his nephews went on paying the women in it for months while there was nothing for them to do. The garment they were making was not called a jean. Nobody called it that for another 70 years. It was called a waist overall to distinguish it from the bib overall, and in the earliest years it was made in two fabrics, blue denim and the brown-white cotton duck that Davis had been buying for tents. The duck version outsold the denim at first. It was the customers who eventually settled the matter. They preferred the denim, which was softer to begin with, softened further with wearing, and did not stay stiff as bored through the first month of ownership. The denim itself did not come from France, whatever the etymology of the word suggests. It came from a mill in Manchester, New Hampshire, on the other side of the continent, which had been weaving it since the 1860s and was one of the largest textile operations in America. Decades later, the supply moved south to a mill in North Carolina run by another family of German Jewish immigrant brothers, and it was that cloth in the 1920s and 30s that gave the trousers the particular character that everybody now recognizes. The cloth deserves a paragraph of its own because it is the reason the garment behaves the way it does and the reason people become attached to it, and almost nobody knows how it works. Denim is a twill. The weft thread passes under two or more warp threads rather than alternating one for one, which produces the diagonal ribbing visible on the inside of any pair. What makes it denim rather than any other twill is that only one set of threads is dyed. The warp, the long threads running down the length of the cloth, is dyed indigo. The weft running across is left white. Because the weave carries the warp on the outside and the weft on the inside, the fabric comes out dark blue on one face and pale on the other, which is why the inside of a pair of jeans has always been a different color from the outside, and why nobody has ever thought this odd. Then there is the indigo itself. Indigo is a peculiar dye. It does not penetrate the cotton fiber. It sits on the surface in layers, held there mechanically rather than chemically, and every time the cloth is flexed, rubbed, or washed, a little of it comes away and the white core of the thread shows through. Every other dyed garment in a wardrobe is designed to resist exactly this. Denim is the only common fabric in which the failure of the dash is the entire point. The cloth records where the wearer's knees bend, where the wallet sits, where the hands go until after a few years, the trousers are a physical map of one particular body's habits. No other mass-produced object does that. The names are a muddle and always have been. Jean, as a word, comes from Genoa and referred originally to a different cotton twill in which all the threads were the same color. Denim, as a word, is generally traced to a serge woven at Nîmes in the south of France. Neither fabric, by the time this story takes place, had anything much to do with the cities it was named after. The denim that made Levi Strauss and Company was woven in New England, in a vast mill town on the Merrimack River in New Hampshire, and later in North Carolina, and it was American through and through. And in the last years of the 19th century, the dye changed as well. Natural indigo had been grown, in enormous quantities and under conditions that do not bear examination, on plantations in India and the American South for centuries. In the 1890s, a German chemical company succeeded in synthesizing it, and within a generation the plantations were finished and the world's indigo came out of a factory. The trousers looked the same. The entire agricultural economy behind them had disappeared, and hardly anybody noticed, because that is what happens to the industries behind familiar objects. The other thing the patent gave them was a great deal of litigation. Within a year, the partners were in court against a San Francisco firm for infringement, claiming $20,000 in damages. They won and were awarded $2,000. This became a permanent feature of the business. For 17 years, the company's principal legal activity was chasing people who had discovered that a bag of rivets cost almost nothing. And in 1890, the patent expired, as patents do, and every manufacturer of work clothing in the United States immediately began riveting their trousers, and the thing that had protected the company for 17 years ceased to exist overnight. What happened then is the part of the story that actually explains why the name survived, because by 1890, the protection had stopped mattering. Over the preceding 2 decades, the firm had done, without any particular theory about it, all of the things that a modern brand consultant would charge a great deal of money to recommend. In 1873, the arc of orange stitching had appeared on the back pocket, for no reason anyone has ever been able to document, and it is still there and is now one of the oldest continuously used apparel marks in the world. In 1886, a leather patch was added to the waistband, showing 2 horses harnessed to opposite ends of a pair of trousers and failing to pull them apart, an illustration aimed at a customer base that was not necessarily going to read the text. And in 1890, the year the monopoly lapsed, the company assigned its heavy blue denim waist overall the lot number by which it has been known ever since. The same year, Levi Strauss and his 4 nephews incorporated the business formally. He kept the majority of the shares and divided the remainder among the children of his sister Fanny, and made himself president, and went on coming to the office. The competitors could copy the rivets. What they could not copy was 20 years of storekeepers from Tucson to Portland who knew what the 2-horse patch meant when a customer came in and asked for the ones that did not tear. Which brings us to the thing that did not happen. Ask almost anybody where blue jeans come from, and a version of the following will come back. A young immigrant arrives in San Francisco at the height of the gold rush, carrying rolls of heavy canvas that he intends to sell for tents and wagon covers. He discovers that there is no market for tents, but that the miner's trousers are falling apart. He takes his canvas to a tailor, or takes it up himself, and produces the first pair of jeans. Later he dyes the fabric blue, and later still he adds the rivets, and an empire follows. Every element of that is wrong, and the errors are instructive. He did not arrive at the height of the rush. He arrived in 1853, when it was already subsiding. He did not bring canvas for tents. He was a wholesale dry goods merchant, importing a full line of merchandise. He did not make trousers on arrival or for 20 years afterwards. He did not dye brown canvas blue. The denim was woven blue from the start, and the duck was never dyed at all. And he did not think of the rivets, which were the work of another man in another state nearly 2 decades later. So where did it come from? Partly from a genuine confusion. The first riveted trousers really were made partly of duck, and duck looks and feels a great deal like canvas, and a surviving example of some heavy brown trousers sold by the company in the 19th century seems to have sent early researchers down that road. But mostly it came from the company itself. Because after 1906, the company did not know. It had lost its records, all of them in a single week. And what it had instead was a founder within living memory, a product with an unusually good story attached to it, and an advertising department. In the middle of the 20th century, a national magazine ran a piece describing a 20-year-old Levi Strauss sailing into San Francisco in 1850 with a roll of canvas in his baggage. A popular television western produced an episode dramatizing the tent canvas invention as fact, with a well-known comic actor in the role of Levi. The company's own advertisements for years gave the founding date as 1850, 3 years before the man had set foot in California. None of the people involved were being dishonest particularly. They were doing what institutions always do with a gap in the record, which is to fill it with the most satisfying available shape. And the shape is very satisfying. It is the whole American myth in a single garment. The immigrant with nothing, the improvised solution, the flash of inspiration, the fortune. Set against it, the truth is a story about a middle-aged wholesaler receiving a letter in the post and deciding to pay a filing fee. It has no gold in it and no scene, and it happens to be one of the more admirable things anybody did in American business in the 1870s. It took a professional archive to establish any of this. The company hired its first historian at the end of the 1980s and gave her the job of assembling out-of-court records, patent files, invoices in other people's collections, city directories, newspaper morgues, and surviving garments bought at auction, an account of its own past. Much of what is now known about Levi Strauss, the man, comes from that work, done a century after his death, in a building 10 blocks from the one that burned. He remains, even so, a curiously unlit figure. There are photographs, an elderly man with a full white beard, small spectacles, a dark suit, and the expression of somebody being detained from his work. There is almost no correspondence. There are no diaries. There is one surviving personal letter of his in the company's collection, a note of thanks to a Bavarian couple who kept a store and had sent him a bottle of wine at the holidays, and it was acquired in the 21st century by an archivist who had to trade a gold coin for it. What can be reconstructed is a shape of life rather than an interior. He never married. There is no record of a courtship, no rumor that survived, nothing. He lived for most of his adult life in his sister Fanny's household in San Francisco, first with her and David Stern, and later, after Stern's death in the mid-70s, with Fanny and her children, and after Fanny's death, he stayed in the same house. He was, by every surviving account, Uncle Levi, a bachelor uncle to a large number of nieces and nephews, present at every family occasion, and at the center of a house that was not his own. He walked to the office. He kept the same hours for 40 years. He was in the building on Battery Street 6 days a week, and when he grew older and his heart began to trouble him and the doctors advised rest, he went to the office anyway and let the nephews carry more of it. He took the family to a property down the peninsula in the summers and, in later years, to a resort on the Monterey coast, where the prominent men of San Francisco went, and he seems to have enjoyed it without conspicuously belonging to it. One of the very few things he ever said on the record about money survives from an interview given in the 1890s. He was asked, in effect, whether wealth had made him happy, and his answer was that riches do not bring happiness to the people who own them, and that the pleasure was in spreading it. That is the kind of sentence a rich man says to a reporter, and it would be easy to leave it there. What makes it worth repeating is that the Ledger agrees with him. In 1897, he learned that the state legislature had funded scholarships at the University of California for students from each of the state's congressional districts. He put up the money for 28 more. Half of them were reserved for women, at a moment when the argument about whether women should be at university at all was still, in most of the country, considered live. Those scholarships are still awarded. He gave to Jewish orphanages and to Catholic and Protestant ones, and the resolution the San Francisco Board of Trade passed after his death made a point of noting that in his charity neither race nor creed had been recognized. In a city and a century where philanthropy was almost always denominational, that was a deliberate policy, and it was noticed. He was 73 years old and still president of the company in the September of 1902. He fell ill in the third week of the month. It was brief. On the night of Friday, the 26th of September, in the house on Leavenworth Street where he had lived with his sister's family, he died in his sleep. The funeral was held 3 days later, in the house rather than the temple, with the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel conducting. The family was joined by the merchants he had traded with for half a century, by the members of the Board of Trade, and by something close to 100 employees and former employees, which in a firm of that period was an unusual thing to record. The police were required to keep order in the street outside. When the coffin left for the station, 7 railway carriages had been reserved to carry the mourners south to the cemetery at Colma, where the dead of San Francisco go, the city itself having long since run out of room for them. The shops of San Francisco closed for the day, not the Jewish shops, the shops. The will was filed a fortnight later. He left the business and the bulk of what he had to his 4 nephews, Jacob, Sigmund, Louis, and Abraham Stern, the sons of Fanny and David, who had all been working in it for years. He left substantial sums to his nieces, to the children of his half-brother and half-sister, and, in a provision that says as much about him as anything else in this account, to long-serving employees by name. And he left large bequests to the orphanages, to the Home for Aged Israelites, to the benevolent societies, to the same list he had been giving to for 50 years. The size of the estate is one of the few genuinely open questions about him. According to some sources, it came to a little under $6 million, made up almost entirely of shares in the company. According to others, working from a different reading of the probate record, the figure was several times that. If any of you have access to documents that settle the question, leave a comment below. It is the kind of thing that gets copied from book to book for a century without anyone going back to the file. What is not in question is the shape of it. A man who arrived in a country at 18 with no capital, in a trade his family had been confined to by law, died 55 years later as one of the wealthiest men on the Pacific coast, having given a good deal of it away while alive, and left the rest to his sister's children and to institutions for other peoples. He had also, in the last years, been worrying about the fire risk in San Francisco. He was not alone. The city was built largely of wood on a peninsula with an inadequate water system, and the men who ran its businesses had been raising the subject for years. 3.5 years after his funeral, at a little after 5 in the morning on the 18th of April, 1906, the ground moved. The earthquake did considerable damage. What destroyed the city was what followed. Fires that started in 100 places at once, in a town whose water mains had been severed by the same shock, and which burned for 3 days. The fire chief, the one man in San Francisco who genuinely understood its water supply and how to fight a fire in it, was fatally injured in the first minutes of the earthquake and played no part in what came next. That single fact is regarded by historians of the disaster as among the most expensive coincidences in American urban history. The commercial district went. Levi, Strauss and Company lost its headquarters, its factory, its warehouses, and its entire inventory. It also lost, though nobody at the time thought to describe it as a loss, every piece of paper the firm had generated since 1853. The ledgers, the letter books, the invoices, the photographs, the sample garments, the correspondence with a Reno tailor about metal rivets. Jacob Stern lost his house as well. What the 4 nephews did in the following months is the reason the name is still on the label. They did not liquidate, and there was a strong argument for liquidating. The assets were gone, and the insurance situation across the city was a catastrophe. They set up temporary offices, found premises, and had a new factory running before the end of the year, with the frame of a new headquarters going up. They went on paying their employees through the whole period when there was no factory for those employees to work in and no legal or commercial obligation whatever to do so. And they extended credit to the storekeepers who were their customers, men who had also lost everything in 100 towns across the West, so that those stores could restock and reopen. It reads, at this distance, like public relations. It was not. There was no public relations industry yet, and there was nobody to tell. It was simply what the household of a man who had been giving $5 to an orphanage since 1854, regarded as the way one behaved. The company has been trading on the reputation established in those months for 120 years, and it is one of the rare cases in which the reputation was earned before it was useful. Jacob Davis was still running the manufacturing when the fire came and helped put the factory back together, and died 2 years later in 1908, at which point his son took over the same job. He had been with the firm since the patent. Outside Reno, where a plaque now marks the site of his shop, almost nobody has heard of him. It is worth saying who the four nephews actually were, because they are usually reduced to a line about an inheritance, and because the way they married explains a great deal about how San Francisco worked. Jacob was the eldest and took the presidency after his uncle's death, and held it for nearly 20 years. Sigmund followed him. Louis and Abraham took the treasury and the secretaryship. They had grown up in the house their uncle lived in, gone into the business in their 20s, and spent their entire adult lives inside it. None of them ever did anything else. Two of them married two sisters, the daughters of a French-born banker in San Francisco, who had gone on to run one of the great international finance houses of the century from Paris. That single connection tells you what the Bavarian merchant families of California had become within one generation. Not shopkeepers who had done well, but a network tied by marriage into the banking of two continents, in which a wholesale clothing firm on Battery Street and a merchant bank on the Rue Pillay-Will were, socially speaking, the same room. Sigmund's only child was a daughter, Elise. Her marriage in 1914 brought into the family the young man who would eventually save the company, which is either the vindication of the entire 19th century practice of arranging marriages within a small circle, or an extremely fortunate accident, and there is no way now to tell which. Sigmund died in the spring of 1928. 3 years later, his widow Rosalie, who by then sat on the city's own recreation commission, bought a wooded canyon in the western districts of San Francisco, a natural bowl of eucalyptus and sand, with acoustics that the city's superintendent of parks had noticed and drawn her attention to, and gave it to San Francisco outright, on one condition, which was that whatever was performed there had to be free to anybody who walked in. It was dedicated in the summer of 1932, and the symphony played there a fortnight later, and free concerts have been given in that grove every summer since, through a depression, a war, and everything that has happened to the city in the 90 years afterwards. It is named for a man whose principal occupation was selling work trousers, and it was paid for with the proceeds of them. There is a thread running through this family that is easy to miss because it never announces itself. A $5 donation to an orphanage by a man with nothing in 1854. 28 scholarships in 1897, half of them held for women. Wages paid to a workforce with no factory to work in 1906. A canyon given away with a condition attached about the price of admission in 1931. And later a business school, a set of hospitals, and a foundation that has outlived everyone in this story. None of it looks like philanthropy in the Gilded Age manner, which was practiced in these same decades on the other side of the continent on a monumental scale, with names carved into limestone and libraries in 900 towns. There is no Strauss University. There is no Stern Cathedral. What there is, instead, is a very long list of relatively modest things done consistently for 150 years by people who mostly declined to be photographed doing them. The company that came out of the ashes was, for the next 15 years, a slightly puzzling business. It was still principally a wholesale dry goods house that also happened to manufacture work trousers, and the manufacturing was the smaller half. In 1912, it launched a denim play suit for children, which became the first product it ever sold across the whole United States rather than only in the West, and which turned out, when somebody eventually examined the figures, to be losing money on every dozen sold. By the end of the First World War, the firm was in genuine difficulty. The price of raw cotton collapsed, which allowed manufacturers elsewhere in the country to undercut a West Coast producer who had bought at the old price. Profits fell by a third in a single year. The four nephews were by then elderly men, and the conversation inside the family had turned, seriously, to winding the thing up and dividing what was left. In 1919, Sigmund Stern brought in his son-in-law. Walter Haas had married Sigmund's only child, Elise, 5 years earlier. He came from the same San Francisco world. His own father was a wholesale merchant of the same generation and the same origins, and he had no particular experience of the clothing trade. What he had was an unsentimental eye and a willingness to look at the accounts, which nobody had properly done in years, and it was he who established that the children's play suit was a loss on every sale and that the firm did not actually know which of its lines made money. He argued against liquidation. He reorganized the bookkeeping and the pricing, modernized the factory, and by 1928 he was president, a position he held for a quarter of a century. He and his brother-in-law, Daniel Koshland, are generally credited between them with saving the company, and the account of how they did it contains no genius and no gamble. They found out what the business actually was and then stopped doing the rest of it. The thing that made them was a change in the American imagination that nobody could have engineered. In the 1930s, at the precise moment the western half of the country was in the worst economic condition of its history, the rest of America fell in love with the idea of the West. The films arrived, the dude ranches arrived, where East Coast families paid to spend a fortnight pretending to be cowboys, and went home wanting the trousers the actual ranch hands wore. A garment that had been for 60 years a piece of equipment for men who worked outdoors in the far West became a costume for people who did not, and then a fashion, and then simply a thing that everyone owned. The company added the small details of the period that everybody now takes for the object itself. A folded red tab appeared in the seam of the back pocket in the middle 30s, for no reason except that competitors were copying the pocket stitching and something was needed that could be recognized from across the street. The word overalls gradually stopped being used. Around 1960, the firm formally adopted the word its customers had been using for a generation, which was jeans. During the Second World War, the trousers were classified as an essential commodity and could officially be sold only to people doing defense work, which had the entirely predictable effect of making them the most desirable garment in the country. The soldiers who wore them off-duty in Europe and the Pacific were the first mass distribution the product ever had outside the United States, and the people who saw them wearing them remembered. In the 1950s, the audience changed again. The garment that had signified honest labor to a Depression audience signified to their children the opposite of everything their parents wanted, largely because of two young actors in two films. Schools across America banned them. Nothing in commercial history has ever been as effective as that. By then, the founder's great-nephews were running the firm, Walter Haas Jr. from the late 50s, and his brother Peter after him. And they did two things worth recording. They took the manufacturing into the American South, and they informed the local authorities there that the plants would open only on the condition that black and white workers were employed on equal terms in the same buildings. This was in the late 1940s and the 50s, in advance of the wall and in advance of most of American industry, and it cost them locations and goodwill in places they wanted to be. And they built the international business that turned a regional work trouser into the most widely worn manufactured object on earth. There is a footnote to that last point, which is not really a footnote. For roughly 30 years in a large part of Europe and beyond, a pair of these trousers was not clothing. It was contraband and currency and a statement. They were smuggled in suitcases, traded for sums that represented weeks of an ordinary salary, sold by tourists in hotel car parks, faked in state factories with the pockets in the wrong place. Governments banned them from schools and from workplaces and periodically denounced them in the press, on the entirely correct understanding that what young people wanted when they wanted a pair of American jeans was not really the trousers. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of that. A garment devised to stop the pockets tearing out of a Nevada Teamster's work clothes became, within a century, the single most legible symbol of a way of life, on the far side of a continent that its inventor had left as a child because his family were not permitted to own land. Neither of the two men who patented it would have understood a word of it. Davis was solving a complaint from a customer. Strauss was protecting a supplier relationship and a line of stock. Neither of them was in the business of meaning. There is one more pattern in this family that is worth setting out, because it runs directly against the ordinary shape of an American fortune. The usual arc is well known, and this channel has followed it a dozen times. A first generation builds an operating business. A second generation runs it, competently or otherwise. A third generation, made up of people who have never sold anything to anybody, sells the company, and the proceeds go into trusts and foundations and houses, and what remains of the family becomes a name attached to a wing of a museum. The Wrigleys sold, the Hiltons sold the hotels, the great newspaper families sold the papers. It is not a failure. It is simply what happens when ownership becomes an inheritance rather than an occupation. The descendants of Fanny Strauss did the opposite, twice, at considerable cost. The company was taken public in 1971, at which point it was selling something over $400 million a year and employing 20,000 people. 14 years later, the family took it back, buying out the public shareholders in what was at the time among the largest such transactions ever attempted in the United States, and returning the firm to private hands where it stayed for more than 3 decades. The stated reason was that a public company can be bought, and that a family which intends to be running the same business in 50 years cannot afford to be for sale. When it eventually returned to the stock exchange, the arrangement was constructed so that control did not leave the family. Whether that is admirable or merely stubborn is a matter of taste. What is not in doubt is that it is unusual. It is a European habit. The industrial families of Germany and Italy have behaved this way for 2 centuries, and it is very rarely found in America, where the pressure to convert a business into money is close to irresistible, and the tax code is designed to help. Alongside it ran the other inherited habit. Walter Haas Sr. and his wife, and their sons after them, gave on a scale in San Francisco that reorganized parts of the city, the university across the bay, where the business school carries the family name, and where the founders' 28 scholarships were still being awarded a century later. The hospitals, the museums, the foundation the family established in the company's name. One of the sons bought the city's baseball team, largely to stop it being moved to another state, and ran it for a decade at no obvious profit to himself. The line from a $5 donation to an orphanage in 1854 is not a straight one, and it should not be sentimentalized. But it is traceable, which is more than can be said for most 19th century fortunes. Buttenheim still stands in the hills above the Regnitz Valley, and it is a good deal larger than it was. Something over 2,000 people live there now. There is no Jewish community. There has not been one for a long time, for reasons that belong to a different and much darker chapter of German history than the one this account has been concerned with. And the graves of Levi Strauss's ancestors are in the old Jewish cemetery outside the village, where they have been left alone. The house on the main road where he was born is a museum. It is a modest building. Visitors from a dozen countries arrive there every year, most of them wearing the thing, and stand in the 2 low rooms where a family that could not own land or join a guild raised 7 children and sent every one of them abroad. He is buried on the other side of the world, in a cemetery in the fog belt south of San Francisco, under a stone that gives his name and his dates in no account whatsoever of what he did. There is nothing on it about jeans. There would have been no reason to put anything on it. When he was buried, the word did not yet mean what it means, and the trousers were a line of stock, and what the people at the graveside were bearing was a wholesale merchant who had been generous to orphanages. The company he left has now been controlled by the same family for 6 generations, which no other major American business can claim. The archive that reconstructed his life is 10 blocks from the building that burned with the original in it. The patent expired 136 years ago. The arc of stitching on the back pocket, which nobody can explain, is still there. And the object itself has done something that almost nothing else made in the 19th century has managed, which is to stop being a product and become a fact. Nobody buys a pair because of the rivets. Almost nobody knows the rivets are the reason it exists, or that they were the idea of a Latvian tailor who had failed at gold, at pork, at tobacco, and at brewing before a woman came into his shop in Reno in the January of 1871 and asked for something that would not tear. Between them, 2 immigrants who had each been legally prevented from earning a living in the country they were born in, made the garment that the whole world now puts on without thinking. One of them got his name on the label. The other got a plaque in Nevada. Neither of them, so far as anyone can establish, ever regarded the thing as anything more than a decent solution to a small and ordinary problem. Some fortunes, in the end, are remembered less for the men who built them than for the one object they were careless enough to make properly.